When I opened my door that morning, I froze. A 40-ton whale was lying just feet from my house, barely breathing. It was bigger than anything I had ever seen. The authorities would later tell me to walk away, to let nature take its course. But as I stood there staring at that giant creature, only one thought echoed in my mind: not again, not in front of me. Because the last time the ocean tested me, it didn't take a stranger. It took my son. And what happened on that shore would force me to face the sea for the first time since the night it broke me. But before I tell you how close we both came to dying that day, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Because on this forgotten stretch of the American coast, I truly believed I was the last man left in the world. The wind has a different voice when you live close enough to the ocean. Most people think it howls, but that is only during storms. On quiet mornings before the sun climbs over the grey horizon, it whispers through the broken fence beside my house and slides along the wooden walls like cold fingers searching for warmth. I've lived with that sound for so many years now that silence, when it occasionally comes, feels far more unsettling than the noise. My house stands alone on a forgotten stretch of the American coastline, where the land is rocky and the water turns dark long before the evening arrives. No tourists wander this far anymore, no fishermen anchor nearby, and even the gulls seem to prefer other shores. People in the nearest town, nearly 12 miles inland, know this place well enough, but they rarely speak of it. When they do, they lower their voices slightly, as if afraid the wind might carry their words back to me. Some call this stretch cursed. Others simply call it empty, but a few of the older ones, the ones who remember too much, still refer to me as something else entirely. The man who turned his back on the ocean. I suppose they are not entirely wrong. There was a time when the sea was not my exile but my purpose. I once knew its moods the way a farmer knows his land, where the currents twisted beneath the surface, where the storms gathered before the sky even hinted at them, where the water hid its quiet dangers. Boats used to call my name over the radio when trouble struck. I had pulled men from freezing waves, cut strangers loose from sinking wreckage, and guided trembling survivors into rescue choppers while the ocean tried to claim them back. Fear and I had reached an understanding long ago. It could follow me, but it would never stop me. Until the night it did. But that is not a memory I allow myself to visit often, especially not in the early hours when the world still belongs to ghosts. These days, my life moves with the slow rhythm of the tide. I wake before dawn because sleep rarely stays longer than a few restless hours. The kettle goes on the stove out of habit, though I often forget to pour the tea before it cools. My joints complain louder than the gulls ever did when I step outside, and the wooden boards of the porch bow slightly beneath my weight, as if they too are growing tired with age. From there, I watch the water, not with longing and certainly not with affection, but with the cautious respect one gives an old enemy. I never step into it, not anymore. The closest I come is the wet line the waves leave behind before retreating again. The townsfolk assume I hate the ocean. The truth is more complicated. You cannot hate something that has already taken everything from you. Hate requires energy, and the sea drained mine long ago. That morning began like any other, wrapped in a cold mist that hovered just above the sand. The horizon was barely visible, blurred into the colorless sky so that sea and air became one endless sheet of grey. I remember noticing how unusually still everything felt. Even the wind had softened into little more than a breath. When the world grows that quiet, you start to hear things you normally wouldn't. The creak of distant driftwood shifting with the tide, the faint rattle of pebbles being pulled back into the surf, the slow pulse of waves folding into themselves. I had just lifted my cup when I felt it, a vibration so subtle at first that I thought it was nothing more than the tremor of my aging hands. But then it came again, deeper this time, traveling up through the porch floor and into my boots. The cup on the railing trembled faintly, sending a thin ripple across the surface of the tea. I turned toward the water, At first I saw nothing unusual. The tide had receded farther than normal, exposing a wide stretch of dark, glistening sand. But then my eyes caught something, a shape where no shape should be. Far down the shoreline, perhaps 100 yards from my door, the mist curled strangely around a massive shadow. For a moment, my mind tried to make it into something ordinary. A capsized fishing boat, maybe, or a pile of storm-tossed debris. Yet even from that distance, some quiet instinct inside me rejected those explanations. The shape was too large, too still, and far too alive in the way it disturbed the silence around it. I set the cup down, without realizing I had done so, and stepped off the porch. Each stride toward the shoreline felt heavier than the last, as though the air itself had thickened. With every step, the shadow grew, stretching wider, taller, impossibly vast. The mist thinned just enough for the rising light to touch its surface, and that was when the truth struck me with such force that I stopped walking altogether. It was a whale, a giant, stranded almost directly before my home. For several seconds, perhaps longer, I could do nothing but stare. I had seen whales before, of course, but always from the respectful distance of a boat deck, where their enormity could be admired without being fully understood. Up close, on land, deprived of the water that made them graceful, their size becomes something else entirely. Overwhelming, almost unnatural. This creature was longer than my house, its dark body marked with pale scars and patches of roughened skin that caught the weak morning light. One enormous fin lay half buried in the sand, unmoving, while the other twitched faintly, as if remembering a motion it could no longer complete. Then I saw the eye, half open, clouded yet aware, and in that instant the whale released a sound so low and fractured that I felt it more in my chest than in my ears. A drawn-out, trembling exhale that carried the unmistakable weight of suffering. A thin spray lifted from its blowhole, weak and uneven, before the creature's massive ribs shuddered again. Alive. Barely. But alive. A coldness spread through me that had nothing to do with the morning air. I knew enough about the sea to understand what this meant. Whales do not simply wander onto shore without reason. Something had driven this one beyond exhaustion, disease, injury, starvation, perhaps all three. And out here, with the tide slipping farther away by the minute, time was no longer measured in hours, but in breaths. I should have turned back then, should have gone inside, reached for the phone, called the authorities, let younger and stronger hands deal with what lay before me. That is what any sensible man would have done. But sense has a strange way of losing its authority when the past begins to stir. As I stood there, watching that colossal creature struggle for air, a memory pressed itself forward. One I had buried beneath years of deliberate silence. I saw again the violent churn of black water, heard the distant crack of thunder, felt the desperate grip of small fingers slipping from my grasp despite every ounce of strength I possessed. A life lost to the sea, my failure echoing louder than the storm itself. The whale's eye shifted then slowly until it met mine. There are moments in a man's life when time seems to pause, when the world narrows to a single fragile thread connecting two living things. In that gaze, I did not see a monster of the deep nor a spectacle of nature. I saw something far simpler, a creature standing at the quiet edge between survival and surrender. The tide crept lower, the wind began to rise again, and somewhere deep inside a part of me I had long believed dead stirred painfully awake. "If I walk away now," I murmured to no one, my voice rough from disuse, "the ocean will take another." For the first time in decades I stepped toward the water, not as the man who had abandoned it, but as the man I once was. For a long moment after I stepped onto the wet sand, I simply stood there, listening to the slow collapse of each wave behind me and the uneven breathing of the creature before me. Up close, the whale was even more immense than my first stunned impression had allowed me to understand. Its skin carried the dull, ashen tone of something that had fought too long against suffering. Long, pale streaks ran across its body, some old scars, others frighteningly new, and patches of irritated flesh suggested infection. The smell reached me next, sharp and organic, the unmistakable scent of illness mingled with salt and decay. It was the smell of a body that did not belong on land. The whale exhaled again, a ragged burst of air that trembled as it escaped. Its massive flank rose, then fell, each breath slower than the last. I knew that rhythm. Years ago I had heard it in drowning men. The tide had pulled back farther now, abandoning the whale to its own impossible weight. People think of these giants as indestructible, but the truth is painfully simple. A whale's body is not built to survive without water cradling it. Out here, gravity becomes the executioner. Their organs compress, their circulation falters, and slowly, mercilessly, they suffocate beneath their own strength. I moved closer before my caution could stop me. Easy, I heard myself whisper, though I could not have said whether the word was meant for the whale or for the tremor building inside my chest. Its eye followed me. There is intelligence in the gaze of such creatures, not human, not something easily explained, but undeniable. The surface of that enormous eye reflected the pale morning sky, yet beneath it flickered something deeper. Awareness, perhaps even fear. I had spent enough of my life reading the silent language of those trapped between life and death to recognize it now. "You came too far," I said quietly. "This shore doesn't forgive mistakes." The whale shuddered again. A faint tremor ran along its side, and only then did I notice the subtle depressions lining its lower body. Parasites, likely, possibly worse beneath the skin. Near the base of its dorsal ridge, a series of circular wounds told another story. Infection had already begun its quiet work. This hadn't happened overnight. Whatever battle this creature had been fighting, it had been losing it for days, maybe longer. Behind me, the distant growl of an engine broke the fragile stillness. I turned to see a pickup truck crawling along the far access road, its tires throwing up ribbons of damp sand. Word travels fast in coastal towns. Something this large never goes unnoticed for long. Within minutes, 2 more vehicles appeared, then another. Doors slammed. Figures gathered at a cautious distance, their voices drifting toward me in fragmented murmurs carried by the wind. "Good Lord! Is it alive? Don't get too close." I ignored them. Crowds have a way of turning living tragedies into spectacles. I had seen it before, people drawn by curiosity, held at bay by helplessness. A younger man approached halfway, boots crunching against the shell-strewn ground. "Sir," he called out, "you might want to step back. These things can thrash." "It doesn't have the strength," I replied without turning. He hesitated, then asked the question they always ask when confronted with the immovable reality of nature. "Is there anything we can do?" Before I could answer, another truck arrived bearing the faded emblem of the local marine authority. 2 officials stepped out, already shaking their heads as they surveyed the scene with practiced eyes. One of them, a broad-shouldered woman with a weather-beaten face, approached until the tide line forced her to stop. "She won't last," she said bluntly. "Severe deterioration, probably systemic infection. Even if we refloat her, she'll strand again." The words fell with clinical finality. Protocol would follow, documentation, perhaps a scheduled removal once the inevitable occurred. I knew the routine well enough to predict each step before it was spoken. "So that's it?" I asked, surprised at the rough edge in my voice. She met my gaze evenly. "Sometimes the kindest thing is not to prolong suffering." Kindness. Strange how often that word is used when surrender is easier than effort. The officials spoke briefly into their radios, relaying coordinates, discussing logistics in detached tones that seemed almost obscene beside the whale's labored breathing. A small group formed behind them, watching with that uneasy blend of fascination and dread. Then, as quickly as they had come, the conclusion settled among them. There was nothing to be done. One by one, they began to withdraw. Engines started, doors shut, the gathering dissolved. Soon only the tracks remained, already softening beneath the creeping fingers of the returning tide. I stayed where I was. The wind strengthened, tugging at my coat as if urging me back toward the safety of the porch. For a moment, I considered it. Age has a way of reminding a man of his limits, and the sensible voice inside me spoke plainly. This is not your burden. You have carried enough. Then the whale made a sound unlike the others. Lower, longer, not merely pain, something closer to surrender. And with that sound came a memory so vivid it stole the breath from my lungs. Black water churning beneath a fractured hull, lightning splitting the sky, the terrified cries of passengers swallowed by the storm. I felt again the desperate weight in my arms, the small body I fought to keep above the surface while waves tried to tear him away. I had promised him we were almost safe. I had been wrong. For years afterward, I convinced myself that retreat was survival, that turning away from the sea meant denying it another chance to take what little remained of me. Yet standing there now, watching life slip quietly toward oblivion, I understood something with terrible clarity. Walking away would not protect me. It would only confirm the man I had allowed myself to become. I stepped closer until the wet sand gave beneath my boots. The whale's eye shifted again, tracking my approach with fading strength. Carefully, aware of how fragile even giants can be at the edge of death, I extended a hand and laid it against its skin. It was colder than I expected, not the living warmth of a creature sustained by the deep, but a creeping chill that spoke of failing circulation. Beneath my palm, I felt a faint tremor, the stubborn echo of a heart still refusing to surrender. "You're not done," I murmured. The tide would turn within hours. I could see the distant line where the water had paused in its retreat, preparing for its slow return. But the angle was wrong. When it rose, it would lift the whale only enough to roll it sideways, perhaps worsen the injuries already ravaging its body. Unless... My gaze drifted toward the equipment shed leaning beside my house, little more than a battered structure filled with relics from a life I had tried to forget. Coils of rope, old flotation barrels, a rusted pulley system I had not touched in over a decade. Tools meant for rescue. The sensible voice returned, louder now. "You are not strong enough. You cannot move something that weighs more than your entire world. If you try, you might die out here, and no one would reach you in time." Perhaps all of that was true, but another truth rose to meet it, quiet, immovable. Once before, I had watched the sea claim a life while my strength failed. I would not stand idle and witness it again. The whale's breathing hitched, drawing me back to the fragile present. I rested my hand there a moment longer, feeling the faint persistence beneath the cooling skin. "Listen to me," I said softly, though whether the creature could hear I did not know. "I couldn't save him, but I'm not losing you too." The wind carried the scent of deep water as the first subtle shift in the tide began. Time, indifferent as ever, was already moving. I turned toward the house. Each step felt less like a choice, and more like the echo of the man I used to be. By the time I reached the porch, my decision was no longer forming. It was made. I pulled open the shed door, and the sharp smell of old rope and rusted iron filled the air, ghosts of rescues long past. My hands closed around the thickest coil, the fibers rough against skin that had grown unaccustomed to such work. As I dragged it toward the shore, a single thought settled with unwavering certainty. If the ocean wanted this life, it was going to fight me for it. The rope was heavier than I remembered. Or perhaps it was simply that I was no longer the man who had once hauled bodies through black water without feeling the strain until morning came. The coarse fibers burned slightly against my palms as I dragged the coil across the sand, leaving a crooked trail behind me that the rising wind quickly tried to erase. Every step toward the whale felt like a step backward through time, toward a version of myself I had spent years trying to bury beneath routine and silence. I paused only once, leaning against the shed doorframe to steady the dull ache spreading through my shoulders, and in that brief stillness the past slipped in uninvited, as it so often does when the body is forced to remember what it used to be capable of. There was a time when ropes like this meant urgency, meant hope, meant that somewhere out there, someone was still alive and waiting. I had trained my hands to move without hesitation, to knot lines in darkness, to judge distances in waves taller than houses. Back then, fear was nothing more than a signal to act faster. But memory is a patient hunter. As I approached the whale again, the sound of the surf thickened in my ears until it blended with another ocean entirely, one from years ago, violent and black beneath a fractured sky. I saw the tourist vessel listing helplessly, heard the metal groan as water claimed it inch by inch, felt the freezing shock as I dove without thinking. They told me afterward that the storm had been one of the worst that season, that no one could have predicted how quickly it would turn. But guilt does not negotiate with reason. I remember the small orange life jacket, far too big for the boy wearing it. Remember his fingers locked around my coat as I fought the current. "You promised we'd see whales," he had shouted earlier that day, his voice bright with a child's certainty that fathers control the world. I had promised. God help me, I had promised. Then the wave came, taller than the rest, and in the chaos of foam and thunder his grip slipped, just for a second, just long enough for the sea to choose differently than I had. They pulled me from the water hours later, half-conscious, still calling his name into a storm that no longer cared. After that night, people called me brave for going back as often as I did, for continuing rescues until there were no rescues left in me to give. But bravery is sometimes just a slower form of breaking. Eventually, I stopped answering the radio, stopped walking the docks, moved out here where the horizon asked nothing of me, and yet now, standing beside this dying giant with the rope pooled at my feet, I understood something with painful clarity. I had never truly left the ocean. I had only been waiting for a reason strong enough to make me face it again. The whale's eye shifted toward me as I circled its massive body, searching for a place where the line might hold without cutting deeper into damaged flesh. Up close, I could see the illness more clearly, the faint tremble beneath its skin, the unnatural slackness along its jaw, the slow, exhausted blink of a creature that had traveled too far while carrying too much pain. "You picked the wrong shore," I muttered, threading the rope with hands that remembered the work, even if the rest of me protested. A weak spout of air escaped it, drifting sideways in the wind, and for a moment I imagined it was listening, two worn souls meeting at the thin edge between endurance and surrender. The tide was already whispering its return, sliding closer grain by grain, but it would not rise fast enough on its own. I tightened the knot, testing it with a firm pull, and felt the old steadiness return to my fingers. Not strength exactly, but resolve, the kind that does not ask whether a thing is possible before attempting it. Years ago, I had failed to hold on when it mattered most. That truth had followed me through every silent season since. But as I braced my boots against the sand and gathered the rope across my shoulder, one thought anchored itself deeper than the rest. The sea had taken a son from me without mercy, and today, for the first time since that night, I was ready to take something back. For several seconds, I did nothing but stand there with the rope stretched tight between my hands, listening to the slow thunder of my own heartbeat. Up close, the scale of what I was attempting pressed down on me with almost physical weight. This was not a drifting skiff or a capsized dinghy I could right with leverage and stubbornness. This was a creature that outweighed me by more tons than my mind cared to calculate. The sensible part of me, the quiet survivor that had kept me alive into old age, spoke again. "You cannot move a mountain." But the older voice beneath it, the one carved into me by decades of answering distress calls, replied with something simpler. You don't move the mountain, you wait for the tide, and you help it. I adjusted the rope once more, guiding it carefully along the thick base of the whale's tail, where the muscle was strongest, where the pressure might distribute without tearing skin already ravaged by illness. The whale flinched faintly at the contact, a tremor rolling through its colossal frame, and I froze until the movement settled. Easy now, I whispered, my palm resting briefly against its side. Its skin felt colder than before, the chill deepening in a way that stirred urgency through my veins. Time was narrowing. The wind sharpened, carrying flecks of spray that stung my face as the ocean began its quiet return. I could see the change now, the water inching forward, patient as breath. Good, but not fast enough to save it without help. I dragged the loose end of the rope toward an old iron post half buried near the rocks, a relic from storms long past when fishermen once secured their boats along this very stretch. My shoulders protested violently as I looped the line around it, the fibers groaning under tension. Every pull sent a hot line of pain across my back, but pain has a curious way of clarifying purpose. I leaned my weight into the rope, boots digging trenches into the soaked sand, and pulled until my arms trembled uncontrollably. Nothing. The whale remained where it was, immense and unmoved, its breaths growing shallower. "Come on!" The words slipped out between clenched teeth. I tried again, this time timing the effort with the incoming wash of a small wave. Water curled around the whale's underside, lifting it, barely, but enough that I felt the rope shift a fraction of an inch. That tiny movement sparked something fierce inside me. Not hope exactly, but possibility. I waited, lungs burning, counting the seconds until the next swell. When it came, larger than the first, I hauled with everything left in me. The rope cut savagely into my palms. I welcomed it. A low sound escaped the whale then, deeper than before, vibrating through the line itself. For an instant, I wondered if it was pain, until the great body tilted ever so slightly toward the water. "That's it," I breathed, half in disbelief. But the ocean never grants progress without demanding something in return. The third wave struck harder, knocking me sideways as freezing water surged to my knees. My footing vanished. I hit the sand shoulder first, the impact driving the air from my chest while the rope nearly tore free from my grasp. Salt flooded my mouth. Above me, the sky spun grey and merciless. "Get up!" Something inside snarled. Not a thought, not quite a voice, but an instinct older than fear. I forced myself upright, legs shaking violently, and seized the rope again before the retreating water could steal the ground from beneath the whale once more. For a moment I rested my forehead against the taut line, breathing hard. Age whispered its limits through every joint, every muscle. Yet beneath the exhaustion ran a steadier current, a refusal I recognized from the man I used to be. Years ago, in another raging tide, I had lost my grip when it mattered most. That failure had shaped the quiet ruins of my life. But standing there now, soaked to the bone and trembling with effort, I understood with sudden clarity that this was not just a rescue. It was a reckoning. Another swell gathered in the distance, darker, stronger. I wrapped the rope once around my forearm and squared my stance. "Not today," I said hoarsely, eyes fixed on the rising water. "I don't lose another to the sea." And as the wave rushed toward us, I pulled. The next wave came in heavier than the others, folding over itself with a deep, rolling force that seemed to gather the entire ocean behind it. I felt the rope surge alive in my hands as the water lifted the whale higher than before. Not much, perhaps a few inches, but enough that the sand released its grip with a reluctant sigh. I pulled with everything I had, a raw sound tearing from my throat before I even realized it was mine. For a brief, impossible second, the massive body shifted. Not imagination, not hope, movement, real and undeniable. Then the wave retreated, and with it went my strength. I dropped to one knee, sucking in air that tasted of salt and iron. My hands were no longer just burning. They were wet, slick, and when I glanced down, I saw thin ribbons of red trailing across the rope before vanishing into the foam. Strange. The sight didn't frighten me. Pain has a way of becoming irrelevant when something larger demands your attention. I staggered upright again, forcing my numb fingers to tighten. "Stay with me," I rasped, though each word scraped my throat raw. The whale answered with a low, fractured exhale, its blowhole releasing a crooked mist that the wind immediately tore apart. Its eye rolled slightly toward me, slower now, heavy with exhaustion. I had seen that look before, in sailors pulled half-frozen from wreckage, in survivors hovering just beyond consciousness. It is the look of a body negotiating whether to continue. "Don't you dare," I muttered. Another swell gathered. I could read the water again just as I once had, the subtle darkening, the way the surface tightened before rising. Timing would matter now. Too early, and I would waste what little strength remained. Too late, and the moment would pass. I braced myself, boots digging deep, rope locked across my shoulder. The wave crashed in, freezing water slammed into my waist, nearly spinning me sideways, but I held fast and pulled with a desperation that blurred the edges of the world. Something in my back screamed, a hot, tearing sensation, yet I dragged harder, vision flashing white. The whale tilted again, farther this time, its immense fin shuddering as buoyancy finally began to challenge gravity. "Yes, yes, that's it," I shouted, voice breaking. For the first time, the ocean was not my enemy in this struggle. It was answering. But victories like these are fragile. As the water withdrew, the whale sagged dangerously, its weight threatening to roll the wrong direction. Panic flared sharp and electric. If it turned inland even slightly, no tide would save it. I lunged forward without thinking, pressing both hands against its cold flank. The sheer solidity of it stole my breath, like trying to hold back a collapsing wall. "Easy, easy," I whispered, though my arms trembled violently under the useless effort. Then it happened. The whale made a sound unlike any before, not the broken gasp of suffering, but a deep, resonant vibration that traveled straight through my bones. The enormous tail twitched. Once, then again, weak but deliberate. It was trying. A laugh, half sob, half disbelief, escaped me. "That's it! Fight!" The next wave rose taller, shadowing us both, and when it struck, the whale lifted enough that the rope snapped taut with a sound like a rifle crack. I hauled backward with a strength I did not know remained in me, every muscle locked in defiance of age. For one suspended heartbeat, the world narrowed to the roar of water and the strain in my arms. And then, suddenly, the ground beneath the whale gave way. It slid. Not far, perhaps a foot, but it slid toward the sea. I collapsed backward into the surf, chest heaving, unable to stop the wild, disbelieving grin spreading across my face. Progress, real progress. Yet even as relief surged, fear followed close behind, cold and practical. This was far from over. The tide still needed time, and time was the one thing the whale might not have left. I dragged myself upright once more, swaying, and gripped the rope with shaking hands. "Listen to me," I said softly, meeting that enormous, weary eye. "I'm still here, and I'm not letting go." The ocean gathered itself again beyond the grey horizon, and together we waited for the next wave. By the time the next set of waves began rolling toward us, my body had crossed into a strange territory beyond exhaustion. A place where pain no longer arrived in sharp signals, but settled instead into a deep, constant roar, like the ocean itself had moved inside my bones. My arms felt impossibly heavy, my fingers so stiff I could barely tell whether they still obeyed me, yet the rope remained locked in my grip, as if some older instinct had fused it there. The tide was rising faster now. Water surged around my thighs, then my waist, each retreat pulling the sand from beneath my boots and forcing me to adjust or fall. But with every advance, the whale floated a little more freely, its massive weight no longer fully surrendered to the shore. Almost, I breathed, though the word trembled apart in the wind. The whale's breathing had changed. Gone was the shallow, frantic rhythm from earlier. Now each exhale came deeper, fuller, as the water began to cradle the bulk of its body once again. That alone might have been enough to keep me standing. But then the great fin stirred with more purpose than before, sending a slow ripple through the surrounding foam. Strength was returning. Not much, not yet, but enough to fight alongside me. Another wave approached, larger than the rest, its crest folding silver beneath the pale morning light. I waited, counting without realizing it, feeling the rope tighten as the water lifted the whale higher than it had been since I first saw it stranded. When the surge peaked, I pulled, not with the reckless force of desperation this time, but with the steady, practiced timing the sea had once taught me. The line drew taut, humming with strain, and then the impossible happened with a suddenness that stole the breath from my lungs. The whale moved, not an inch, not a foot, but yards. The ocean accepted it back in a single tremendous slide. The rope tore from my hands as the creature drifted forward, nearly pulling me off balance. I stumbled, catching myself just before the water swallowed me entirely, and could only watch as the whale rolled slightly upright, buoyed at last by the tide's full return. For a moment it remained still, as though stunned by the simple miracle of floating. Then its eye found me again. I cannot explain what passed through that gaze, relief perhaps, or something older than emotion. But it rooted me where I stood. Slowly, with a grace that felt almost ceremonial, the whale drew a deeper breath than any before and released it in a powerful spout that rose clean into the air. The sound echoed across the water, no longer the fractured whisper of a dying body, but the voice of something choosing, fiercely, to live. A laugh broke from me, ragged and disbelieving, before I realized tears had carved warm tracks down my salt-stung face. "You did it," I whispered. "Go on, before the sea changes its mind." For several long seconds, the whale did not move. The current nudged it gently, urging it toward deeper water, yet it lingered just beyond arm's reach. I felt suddenly small standing there, waves tugging at my legs, the rope trailing uselessly beside me. Then the massive tail descended, slow and deliberate, and with one quiet stroke, the distance between us widened. 5 yards, 10, 20. Still I watched, scarcely daring to breathe. Just before the swell carried it beyond the shallows, the whale turned, not fully, only enough that its enormous silhouette curved back toward the shore. Toward me. The motion was unhurried, almost thoughtful, and in that suspended instant the years seemed to collapse inward. I was no longer the man abandoned by the sea, nor the ghost pacing a lonely porch. I was simply a witness to life continuing. The whale dipped once beneath the surface, then rose again farther out, stronger already, its back cutting a dark path through the brightening water. And then, with a final lift of its tail, it vanished into the open ocean. Silence followed, vast and ringing. My legs gave out before I could stop them, and I sank into the surf, chest heaving as the tide curled gently around me. Every muscle trembled with the aftermath, yet beneath the fatigue spread something unfamiliar, something lighter than relief. For the first time in years, the ocean had taken nothing from me. Instead, it had allowed me to give a life back. I closed my eyes, letting the cold water wash over my hands, and somewhere beyond the horizon, a distant spout rose briefly into the morning air. Small now, but unmistakable. The sea, it seemed, was not finished with me yet. The days that followed settled into a quiet so complete that, for a while, I almost convinced myself the rescue had been nothing more than a fevered dream born of too many lonely seasons. My body, however, remembered with ruthless clarity, Every movement carried the dull protest of muscles pushed far beyond their years, and my hands, wrapped now in rough bandages, throbbed steadily with each heartbeat. Even lifting the kettle became an exercise in patience. Yet beneath the ache lived something unfamiliar, something I had not felt in longer than I cared to measure. A fragile anticipation that drew my eyes back to the horizon again and again. I told myself I was only checking the tide. That was a lie. Each morning, I stepped onto the porch before sunrise, leaning against the railing as pale light spilled slowly across the water. The ocean looked unchanged, vast and indifferent as ever, but I no longer felt that same impenetrable distance between us. Once I had watched it the way a man watches a locked door. Now, I watched as though it might open. Nearly a week passed. Then, on the 7th morning, the sea answered. At first it was only a disturbance far beyond the breakers, a subtle rising and falling that did not match the rhythm of the tide. I narrowed my eyes. Breath caught somewhere between caution and hope. The shape surfaced briefly, vanished, then appeared again closer to shore, enormous even at that distance. My pulse quickened. "No!" I whispered, stepping off the porch without realizing it. By the time my boots struck the damp sand, the shape had grown unmistakable. A dark back arched above the water, followed by the clean burst of a spout that caught the newborn sunlight and scattered it into silver mist. The whale, alive, stronger than I had dared imagine. A sound escaped me then, half laugh, half something far more unsteady, and I walked forward until the cold surf curled around my feet. The whale moved with slow assurance, no longer the helpless giant imprisoned by gravity, but a creature reclaimed by its element. It drifted nearer than any wild thing reasonably should, the water rolling gently along its sides. And then I saw that it was not alone. Another spout rose behind it, then another. 3 immense shapes circled at a respectful distance, their movements calm, almost watchful. A pod. Whether they had found it again or had never truly left, I could not know, but the sight rooted me where I stood. For years I had believed the ocean incapable of returning what it took, yet here it was, offering something back in a language too vast for words. The whale I had freed drew closest of all. When it surfaced, its eye broke the waterline, clear now, no longer clouded by the grey veil of suffering. It lingered there, regarding the narrow strip of shore, regarding me. "You made it," I said softly, the wind stealing the words almost as soon as they formed. For a suspended moment, nothing moved. Then the whale descended slightly, gathering itself, and what followed unfolded with a grandeur that seemed to split the morning wide open. Its body surged upward in a single breathtaking motion, higher, higher, until the full enormity of it rose free from the sea. Water cascaded from its flanks like shattered glass, sunlight igniting every falling drop. The breach was silent to my stunned ears, though I knew the impact must have thundered beneath the surface. When it crashed back down, the spray rushed outward in glittering arcs, and a deep vibration rolled through the water to where I stood. Not chaos, not distress, power, life. I found that I was crying again, though I could not have said when the tears began. "You don't owe me anything," I murmured, voice breaking despite my effort to steady it. As if in answer, the whale lifted its tail, slow, deliberate, and held it there for a heartbeat before letting it slip beneath the surface. The others turned with it, their dark forms gliding effortlessly through the brightening expanse. They did not rush away. They simply continued, confident, unburdened. I remained there long after they became distant shadows, the wind pressing gently at my back, the tide whispering across the sand. And in that quiet, something shifted inside me with a softness that felt almost fragile. For the first time since the night the sea had shattered my world, I did not feel like a man it had spared out of cruelty. I felt forgiven. Far out on the horizon, one final spout rose and vanished into the morning light. And I understood then, with a certainty deeper than grief, that some debts between man and ocean are not paid in loss, but in the unexpected grace of a life returned. After that morning, the shoreline no longer felt like the edge of a world I had exiled myself to. It felt, in some quiet and inexplicable way, like a beginning. The ocean returned to its familiar rhythms, the long breathing in and out of the tide, smoothing away the deep grooves our struggle had carved into the sand. If a stranger had wandered past, they would have seen nothing unusual, nothing to suggest that only days before a dying giant had lain where the gulls now pecked idly at shells. The sea erases its stories quickly, but not from those who have stood inside them. I noticed the change first in the silence. It no longer pressed against my ears like a weight. Instead, it listened. My hands healed slowly, though the rope burns left pale, shining scars across my palms. Reminders I found myself tracing absent-mindedly, not with regret, but with something closer to reverence. Pain fades, meaning does not. Even my sleep began to soften. The dreams still came, but they no longer ended with me shouting into black water. Sometimes now they ended with sunlight breaking across waves, and something vast moving peacefully beneath them. Weeks passed before I understood the full measure of what had shifted inside me. One afternoon, while clearing driftwood tangled near the rocks, I caught myself humming. An old habit I had abandoned so completely that the sound startled me. It was a tune my son used to demand whenever we drove the coastal highway, his small hand drumming against the window as he searched the horizon with tireless excitement. He had loved the ocean without ever fearing it. "Are there really whales out there?" he would ask. "All the time," I had told him once with a smile he tried so hard to mirror. "You just have to be patient enough to see them." The memory rose now, not as the sharp blade it had long been, but as something gentler, like touching a scar instead of an open wound. I leaned on the worn handle of my shovel and let the breeze move past me, carrying that distant, ageless scent of salt. "You finally saw them, kid," I said quietly to the empty air. The realization settled slowly but firmly. I had kept my promise after all. Not in the way I once imagined, not with his laughter bright beside me on a boat deck, but in a manner the sea itself had chosen. For years, I had believed the ocean only knew how to take, that it devoured without memory and offered nothing in return. Yet that whale had come to my door when both of us stood at the fragile boundary between endurance and surrender. Saving it had not rewritten the past. Nothing could. But it had loosened the grip that past held on the rest of my days. Near dusk, I began walking the shoreline more often, sometimes farther than my stiff knees appreciated. One evening, the water lay so calm it reflected the sky like burnished steel. I stood watching the horizon when a familiar spout appeared, distant, brief, but unmistakable. Then another joined it, and though they were too far for certainty, something in my chest recognized the rhythm. I lifted a hand without thinking. "Keep going," I whispered. Whether it was the same whale no longer mattered. What mattered was the understanding that followed. The sea had not singled me out for punishment all those years ago, nor had it returned now seeking to balance some hidden scale. The ocean simply is, vast enough to hold both loss and mercy without explanation. The wind freshened, tugging gently at my coat as the last light slipped toward the water. I turned back toward the house, its windows glowing faintly against the gathering blue, and felt no urge to close myself off from the sound of the tide. Tomorrow, I decided, I might drive into town, perhaps mend the old radio, maybe even answer if someone called. The thought no longer felt impossible. At the porch steps I paused and looked once more at the darkening expanse. "For the first time since the night I lost you," I said softly, imagining my son somewhere beyond the reach of storms. "I don't feel abandoned anymore." A long wave folded onto the shore, smooth and unhurried, before slipping back into the deep. Sometimes the ocean takes, Sometimes it gives, and once in a rare lifetime, it sends something back, not to replace what was lost, but to remind a weary heart that it is still capable of rising with the tide.